Iran has elected a new president. Ibrahim Raisi won the election in a landslide with more than 60% of the vote. Raisi currently serves as Iran's top judge, a position he was appointed to by the country's supreme leader. Now, the incoming president's political views are considered ultra-conservative by many, and he is currently under U.S. sanctions for human rights abuses. Iran saw its lowest ever voter turnout this year for the presidential election at just under 50%. And so for more on this, we're joined now by Kamran Bokhari. He's the Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, and he's also a National Security and Foreign Policy Specialist at the University of Ottawa. Kamran, always good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Natasha.
Kamran, before we get to who Ibrahim Raisi is, let's begin with the reporting of this story, because there are all these reports that he won by a landslide and he swept the election, and yet we know the voter turnout was low. So what is the disconnect there? Are ordinary Iranians getting disenchanted with this process?
Ordinary Iranians have been disenchanted with this process for decades now. It's only gotten worse with this latest election. Not only is this the lowest voter turnout, we have not seen electoral engineering on the part of the supreme leader and the various institutions that manage the election process like this in the past. They disqualified people who are actually loyal to the system in order to get this guy. In other words, the engineering that was done behind the scenes was basically designed for him to actually get the votes today that he needed, even if it was a low voter turnout, so that he could make it to the top job.
So let's talk about him, Ibrahim Raisi, and a controversial background as he moves forward in this new role. What can you tell us about him?
So there have been two types of past presidents that we've seen: people who were actually clerics and or politicians. This guy is neither in the conventional sense. Raisi, I've not come across any evidence that suggests that he ever completed seminary studies in order to become like an Ayatollah, though he does use the title of Hujjatul Islam, but it's one of those that sort of everybody uses to brush up their credentials. So he's not a cleric. On the other hand, he's not like a politician. He's not even Ahmadinejad, who was a populist who actually got votes and had a political voter base because of being the mayor of Tehran, because of being a governor of provinces and rising through the system. This guy is an operative. He has been rewarded as he spent his entire career, or the bulk of it, as a prosecutor, basically torturing people and sending people to their deaths who opposed the political system or even opposed some policies of the current regime. So he's an operative. Loyalty has been rewarded by Khamenei, and it really tells you a lot about how the Islamic Republic is a sick regime in the sense that its best days are behind it. If Raisi is the best guy they can come up with, then that means this regime is in trouble.
Let's talk a bit on what you just mentioned, that many believe he is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Iranians, mostly political prisoners. He was reportedly a member of something called the Death Committee in Iran, that he was the person who led the mass executions of almost 5,000 political prisoners in 1988. How did he do this? Why did he do this?
So here's the thing. The regime had to, the Islamic Republic regime established by Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers constituted one of three factions that led the revolution against the monarchy in '79. The other two factions were the leftist Communist Today Party and the liberals. The clergy and led by Khomeini sidelined both of them, and then obviously had to, could not rule, on its own unless it got rid of its opponents. So it had four different types of opponents. It had the opponents who were loyal to the previous regime of the Shah, the liberals who wanted to overthrow the Shah and did not agree with the Ayatollahs, and the leftists, as well as a group called the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, which the U.S. considers as a terrorist organization because of its engagement in terrorist activities during the 80s and the 90s. This regime decided that the best way out of this scenario is to just arrest people and eliminate as many to send a message that whoever opposes the regime is going to face this a similar fate. Raisi was heavily involved in that. The government at the time was a nascent one, the Islamic Republic. It did not have people who were, if you will, prosecutors by tradecraft. So what they compensated that for was people with zeal. And he's a zealot. Ibrahim Raisi was a zealot who showed more zeal than tradecraft, and that's why he was rewarded. They needed people like that in order to eliminate opponents.
So let's talk about Canada's relationship with Tehran. So we've got this situation where this man, who may very likely be at the center of the massacre of thousands of Iranians, political prisoners in 1988, the very event that the Canadian Parliament had declared as a crime against humanity. Plus, this same man was leading the Iranian side of the investigation into the falling of that plane, PS-752, where countless Canadians and people with connections to Canada died last year. And many international observers, not just Canadians, have said that the Iranian part of that investigation is flawed, deeply, deeply flawed. So if this guy is in charge in 1988 of that, and in 2020 and 2021 of the investigation, where Canada has major problems on both those fronts, how does Ottawa move forward with the relationship, if they do at all?
So Ottawa will have a hard time dealing with this administration in Iran, partly because of what you just said. But unfortunately, I have to say this, that cover-up is complete of that whole incident with the shooting down of the Ukrainian aircraft in which many, many Canadian Iranians lost their lives. I don't think that Canada can do much about that, and it doesn't have the leverage. But what we need to bear in mind is that people who are Canadian citizens of Iranian background will unfortunately have a very hard time traveling back and forth to their motherland because of this new administration, which is going to be far more suspicious of people coming from Western countries, particularly Canada, and viewing them as potential spies. So I'm sad to say this, but our fellow Canadians who are from Iran, they face tough times ahead.
Why would they be suspected of being spies more now than a year or two ago?
Because you have a prosecutor in office who spent his entire life chasing ghosts and sending innocent people to death, to the gallows and to torture chambers. He has no tradecraft in terms of, or experience in terms of policymaking, the political economy, governance, much less foreign policy. So what do you expect? A guy who spent all his life chasing people because he thought that they were enemies of the regime, that's what he's going to do.
Okay. So, Kamran, we only have time for one quick question and answer. So let me ask you what I actually think is the most important thing, which is, what does this actually mean to the lives of millions of Iranians who are still struggling in their country? What does Raisi mean for them? Anything at all?
I think that the best that they can hope is that because Raisi is now president, and we have to see how the United States and the wider West deals with him diplomatically, politically, especially in the light of the efforts to return to the Iranian nuclear deal, that what kind of difference can we make? What kind of influence can this engagement with the West, this engagement with the United States make in terms of shaping the behavior of Iran with Raisi as president? Can that become, translate into better living conditions for common Iranians?
Okay. We'll be watching. Kamran, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Kamran Bokhari is the Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington and a National Security and Foreign Policy Specialist at the University of Ottawa. You're watching CBC News Network.